thanks everyone for being on this call, this webinar. This webinar is being recorded as well, so we will post it as soon as we can for your reference as well as for those who couldn't make this call. So today's webinar is about the NABat program in BC, and it will be presented by Jason Ray from the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, as well as Orville Dyer from the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. The BC NABat program really is built because of these two people in their position, without whom it wouldn't be possible to have built this and to keep this program going. It's also received a lot of support from Cori Lausen with the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Thanks to the three of you for making this webinar possible. So this will really be a bit of an introduction that BC is going to provide you all what was needed to build their massive provincial NABat program, and what is needed to keep it going. And hopefully this information will help other jurisdictions to figure out what they can do to hopefully accomplish something similar. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jason. Thank you very much for speaking, and we're all very interested to learn about this.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Jordi. So first of all, I'd like to say welcome to everybody who's come here today. My name is Jason Ray, and as already said, I'll be talking about the North American Bat Monitoring Program in British Columbia. I'm also joined by Orville Dyer from Ministry of Environment and Cori Lausen from Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. As you already said, NABat is implemented in BC by Wildlife Conservation Society Canada as part of the overall continental NABat program. Just give me a second to see. Sorry, I got the slides here. First of all, an acknowledgement to all of our partners. We receive funding from 4 major sources, along with in-kind support and volunteer hours from numerous organizations across the province. See just the list here. We'll start today with an overview procedure and review how NABat was started in BC in 2016. From there, we'll move on to discuss how and why BC MOE and Parks partnered with us in 2018, discuss current status in 2019, highlight a few key challenges and lessons learned, and then wrap it up and take any questions at the end. So NABat has 5 main objectives. First of all, to establish baseline bat diversity and relative abundance, provide the architecture for coordinated bat monitoring to support local, regional, and range-wide inferences about trends in bat populations in response to white nose syndrome, climate change, wind energy, and habitat loss. We'll also quantify the impact of white nose syndrome on bat populations of different species and detect early warning signs of population declines, facilitate mitigation and recovery actions to enable the effective evaluation of management and conservation efforts with information on bat population trends. And in BC, our major focus has been on establishing this monitoring prior to the arrival of white nose syndrome, but post white nose syndrome, we can also monitor the species changes as species recover at different rates. Now, so far, the major component of NABat monitoring is acoustic, but NABat also relies on information from roost counts, from BC Community Bat Program, monitoring sentinel roosts, mist netting, and other sources of data that we will not discuss in detail here. Now, for the acoustic monitoring, we begin late May and early July. And each sample location or grid cell has 2 to 4 passive acoustic bat detectors deployed for 7 nights per year. Note that continental guidance only suggests minimum of 4. More or less is just because it fits in a single work week, so we've chosen longer. Because this gives a greater chance to not miss the rare species in your areas. For monitoring in BC, we mostly use SM2s and SM4s for the passives because that's what we had available. This is just an example of what a passive detector setup looks like. You'll see the microphone is mounted on a roughly 15-foot telescoping pole. We've painted it camo to reduce the public chance of detection, and the detector is either locked or chained at the base, left hidden in bushes, unless it's on private land, in which case you can just kind of leave it where they'd like. The chance of theft and people fiddling with it is less. There are also 2 active transects. These 2 driving transects are conducted during the same week that the passive detectors are deployed. For this, a microphone is mounted on a vehicle roof with an attached GPS unit. The transects are driven at roughly 30 kilometers per hour or 30 to 45 kilometers. And because this microphone is moving, we then assume that each recording is an individual bat and use this to establish a relative reed species abundance. And for our monitoring in BC, our kits primarily use NABat SD1s, NABat SD2s, and EM touches, but there are also several other options for this as well. Just an example of a car-mounted microphone. This is the Titley NABat car mount with the mouse GPS, but Wildlife Acoustics sells similar car mount brace for their EM touch as well. Note that the EM touch relies on the GPS in the phone or other device that your EM touch is connected to. It doesn't have an external. Okay, so we also log various covariates for each grid cell, as many as possible, and at the beginning and end of each transect. The covariates in the grid cell measured are temperature, humidity, and moon phase, supplemented with wind speed, precipitation, and notable weather events when there's a weather station within 10 kilometers of the grid cell. This isn't always necessarily often the case, but when it's available, we use it. For the transects, we note any precipitation throughout, record temperature, humidity, and wind speed, moon phase, and cloud cover at the start and end of the transect. So how do we select where and when to monitor? NABat uses a weighted generalized random tessellation stratified design, or GRTS. This method produces a spatially balanced sampling methodology with random placement of high priority cells while allowing for unequal probability sampling and accommodating oversample of sites that can arise within field implementation. This has been set up by the Continental Program, and they've provided layers for 10 by 10 square kilometer grid locations that span all of North America. This does also include Mexico, though I didn't select that layer for this map you'll see here. Zoom in a little bit. BC itself contains just over 10,000 potential grid cells. Now, of course, we can only monitor a few of these total cells in BC. As we accept new grid leaders, we ask them to examine their local area and select the highest priority accessible GRTS number within reasonable driving distance. Continental guidance suggests only excluding cells if monitoring is not possible, though in some of our grid cells we do have a little bit of a deviation from this protocol where we put a little bit of preference on choosing cells in known habitat, particularly where prior monitoring had taken place, and or because results would be a little bit more relevant locally. Because these cells are using a weighted GRTS ID, choosing a lower priority number does ultimately mean that your results are weighted lower in the continental analysis, though. So the high priority ones are more heavily weighted. From there, we select locations that are for the locations for the 4 passive detectors. We aim to place detectors in as many different habitat types as possible, but also spread them out by putting 1 in each quadrant of the grid cell. Getting 1 detector in each quadrant is not always possible, though, due to access concerns, no roads, so on and so forth. The detectors can be placed in the same quadrant, particularly if it means that you're going to sample different habitat types with each detector. This does occur several times in our BC sample as well. In BC, we also ask that grid leaders aim to deploy at least one detector in a commuting zone, a place where a bat would be moving between foraging and roosting habitat and things like that. And otherwise avoid deploying directly in foraging areas because you're more likely to get a high percentage of recordings from same individuals circling around and otherwise lower quality recordings. So here you see our 4 detectors in a grid cell, those little red dots. We have 1 in each quadrant in this grid cell. And for transects, recall that they should be roughly 30 to 45 kilometers long. Driven in a roughly linear direction, they should pass through at least 2 of the quadrants with detectors in them, but also avoid major highways so they don't have to deal with other traffic and things like that. Because these cells are only 10 by 10 kilometers square, the transect will not be able to stay within the boundary. Yeah, note that because some of our grid cells have few drivable roads, this does mean the grid cells can be a little bit less than linear, or sorry, the transects can be a little bit less than linear. Okay, so how do we get started in BC? For our first year, in 2016, we monitored 22 grid cells. For this, we assembled about eight kits of equipment and shipped them around between grid cells. Each kit contained everything needed to sample: 4 passive BAT detectors, 1 transect detector with car mount, including other things like telescoping poles, rebar, batteries, SD cards, what have you. For those of you looking to assemble your own kits, a single kit worth of equipment is worth roughly $14,750 Canadian. This goes up and down depending on the types of detectors you want to put in there and whether your local participants also have some of their own equipment or not. This is just an example of the equipment log we use for our kits. Basically, this provides a list of what we sent to each grid cell, and it helps make sure that everything gets pulled out of the field. Sometimes people are a little bit inclined to forget the temperature loggers, for instance, because they're deployed a little bit away from the other detector setups, and there's only one in your grid cell. We can provide a list of the generic contents we stick in a kit for anybody who's interested afterwards. So these are our first 22 grid cells. We focused on getting participants in southern BC because this is where the population density was higher and because it was easier to find interested people. Also because we feared white nose syndrome would arrive quickly, with Washington having just announced their first detection in March of that year. These grid cells, with one exception, are actually still monitoring grid cells. The only exception is one detector in southwestern Vancouver that did move. Or sorry, one grid cell that moved. So we didn't start off expecting to do 20 grid cells, though. In fact, we were actually only funded for about 8, but additional partner buy-in did allow major expansion. The BC BAT action team was formed that year, and its first action plan actually highlighted the need to survey and monitor bat populations across the province. That action plan and Cori's network of biologists did actually lead to substantial participation from biologists across the province in that first year. This program was also promoted in Cori's 2016 acoustic analysis training course, which is basically a targeted audience of biologists, many of whom did end up starting their own grid cells in their local areas too. We also found many key partners through existing connections with BC Community BAT programs, biologists, NCC, Nature Conservancy of Canada, and other community naturalists we had connections with. So one primary limiting factor was the bank of detectors required to start the monitoring. As I said before, each kit contains a large dollar value of equipment, so you need to have those detectors on hand prior. Since surveillance must be done within a roughly 1.5-month window, deployment lasts 7 days, and shipping between cells takes at least 2 business days, we estimated each kit of equipment could only be used for roughly 3 to 4 grid cells at most. In reality, we've gotten about 3 grid cells per kit, but we have stretched it to 4 in some cases. Just logistically, it's pushing it to get more because people have to have a little bit of flexibility in their deployment times and so on and so forth. You could experiment with fitting more cells in, but these timelines tend to be fairly tight for us, at least. The next, I'll turn it over to Orville Dyer so we can discuss how and why BC MOE became involved in 2018.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Orville.
Thanks, Artie. Thanks, Jason, for the good background. My part of this today is just to mention a little bit about why British Columbia is involved. Some of the specific benefits to us, Jason's already gone over the broader benefits to BATS and the program in general, and some of the information on how we've been funding the program as well. So as many of you on the line know, if you work for government, we're very reliant on expert advice, and especially if it is in a written plan with group consensus of experts in it. So NABat is in a bunch of different plans, which really increases our perception of the legitimacy and confidence in the program as well. So in case you're applying for it, it's good to know that it's referenced as a good thing to do in the National White Nose Plan from the United States, also the Canadian White Nose Plan. In Canada, well, I guess the States too, there's a trilateral committee for wildlife and ecosystem conservation and management. That's Canada, US, and Mexico, and they've put out a statement saying we should do it there as well. In Canada, the Species at Risk Recovery Plan for little brown, northern, and tricolored bat, it's recommended in there. And as Jason already mentioned, we have the BC Bat Action Plan. That's a high priority for that as well. So it's very easy for us to go to our supervisors and say, lots of experts across North America recommend this, and lots of people are already doing it. Some of the additional benefits, not just to the bats and bat programs, but specifically to the province, is having some bat detectors for other uses was a really compelling reason for us to get involved. It was really helped us get some buy-in. Having that equipment was good for us to be able to address some specific management issues in parks or conservation lands like building roosts or habitat alteration. And we've also used them to test some forestry best practices for wildlife habitat features. Some groups are using them to detect bats and high concentrations of bats for land acquisition programs, and certainly it's helpful to do some assessments for old mines or caves or important feeding sites, and to narrow down the generalized locations of hibernacula. Also, we've been using it to confirm species distribution. In a lot of parts of our province, we didn't have a great map of where bats, specific species of bats were there. And also for education, we're putting it into a couple of education programs as well. Another big thing was professional development for our staff. Many of us are biologists and professionals under our College of Applied Biology. So there's a training requirement annually for us to keep learning about our profession. And this has been one of the things that we've pitched, that if you learn about how to set up bat stuff, this will help you meet some of your training requirements. So Jason and Cori put on a training session once a year right at the very beginning, and they've also developed a bunch of videos, and we've just downloaded some of these videos onto our cell phones or iPads, and you can take it out in the field with you. There's paper copies as well, but having this extra information makes it really easy to set things up. Another thing is, I believe, and I haven't documented this for sure yet, that it helps create a lot more interest in bat management, so greater cohesion with our regional staff regarding bats, and a lot more staff who can implement bat-related actions on the ground. I think that because they learned how to use the detectors and have some more information about bats, they have some examples where they're using it now in their jobs more than they did before. It's also new data. I mentioned our new maps. So our BC Conservation Data Center and Wildlife Species Inventory Database, all this data is going into there. So we make that available for the Conservation Data Center for mapping, for setting up the status in BC of species, conservation status. And also it's available publicly to professionals who are doing environmental assessments. Many of our professionals in BC don't seem to consider bats very well, but if it's in these databases, which they're supposed to check all the time, then it's easy for them to see which species are there, and hopefully that will help to get them more involved as well. It's also helping us to target some areas for additional inventory, netting, and other things, in particular for species at risk. So pallid bats are here in British Columbia, and this system has detected a couple of potential pallid bat sites outside of their normal range. Same with northern myotis. It's endangered nationally and red listed in BC. And another species that we haven't actually confirmed yet in BC with a physical sample, Brazilian freetails and canyon bats, they're both being picked up through this acoustic detection array as well. Already mentioned land management and park conservation management. And we have a new program as well, bat-friendly communities, we've been doing in combination with the folks in Alberta as well. So some of the bat-friendly communities now are using NABat to teach people about it, get interest, and also to focus on acquisition sites for habitat protection and local awareness. So I'm just going to jump to funding now. So partnerships are absolutely key for us. We almost never jump into anything without having partners. We seldom like to pay for everything. So it was great that WCSC started the program in BC and we're funding it. They also go to funders like Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation and Fish and Wildlife Compensation Programs, which we recognize have a very detailed technical review of proposals, and they've already vetted a lot of these processes for us, so that gives us a lot of extra incentive to value the programs. And I already mentioned the equipment, so we had no equipment at the beginning, and we were able to get about roughly 15 detectors through our Ministry of Environment base budget, and we targeted the end of the fiscal year when there's a little extra money around to be able to do this, so that really helped us. And then having WCSC already as a partner, that helped us to leverage getting those detectors in the first place too. And then once we had detectors, we were able to use our detectors to help leverage BC Parks to do the same thing. So they got another approximately 15 detectors as well. And then some of our other partners, the Canadian Wildlife Service and Nature Conservancy of Canada also chipped in as well. As far as deployment goes, we're very dependent on our staff for that. It's a pretty high cost, but we have staff out in these areas anyway. Most of it comes from park rangers, some of our ecosystems biologists, sometimes summer staff or partners. So Nature Conservancy, the Comox Valley Land Trust, Pemberton Wildlife Association, Habitat Acquisition Trust, just a lot of different partners with different interests, and they've been an important part of the program as well in terms of deployment. And lastly, analysis is the most expensive part. We've been able to get funding so far from our land-based investment account, and then more recently, Parks License Plate Fund, which is fairly new for BC. And Environment Canada has chipped in a substantial amount as well just the last couple of years too, and hopefully all those things will be able to continue. That was all I wanted to say, but if anybody wants to ask questions, feel free to email or phone later. Thank you. Back to you, Jason.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Orville. That was a good summary. From there, we'll move on to the current status of NABat in BC in 2019. So 4 years after our start, we've grown our NABat grid cell count to over 50 cells in 2019. Our largest year of expansion was actually 2018 when we added about 17 new grid cells. And this is particularly due to the additional involvement from BC MOA and Parks, as Orville was talking about. Our primary focus is now shifting a little bit towards motivating continued efforts. 4 years is a fairly long time to run these continued monitoring efforts for each individual person. Each year we assemble our general bat info reports for landowners, biologists and naturalists also. This basically just highlights the results of their efforts. Looking at doing more flashy poster style reports and stuff like that as well to get the results a little bit more widely spread around. For more specific needs like BC Parks, the entire list that Orville was talking about, we've been looking at expanding the applicability of our analyses as well. That'll be something that's kind of forthcoming as we get a little bit more development on that. So this is our current extensive sampling in 2019. We have grown the extensive coverage since 2016, as you'll see, but there are still some large gaps where we just haven't found any contacts to deploy, and basically extremely low human densities in these areas do make it very difficult to start establishing grid cells in northwestern BC, for instance. In the future, we are still working on expanding to fill those gaps as opportunities arise. We do need a high sample size in BC, particularly because we are working towards a final analysis on a finer scale than the continental program. We need the results to be applicable to this small scale and local environments for these individual participants to use the data that in a way that benefits them. Another reason for the additional cells would be to basically fully capture the species ranges. I'll use the big brown bat occurrence map here because I think it highlights it fairly well. As you can see, there aren't really many orange dots north of the Fort St. John line, but we have the polygon extending well above that because we expect that the big brown bat should be in that range. You'll see the blue dots around there actually do represent other acoustic recordings, most of them from NABat, that are able to provide information that suggests the species should actually be in that area as we expect it should. A little bit more evidence of that prior to actually conducting other surveillance in those areas. So we use a consistent yearly schedule with rough deployment dates for each grid cell to help with coordination and equipment sharing between grid cells, data submission dates, and so on. Circumstances where grid leaders do need flexibility are completely unavoidable though, so you will have to adapt the schedule by each grid cell each year. The chart shown here does give our rough dates as an example. So first we begin equipment organization in April. This is basically doing firmware updates, refilling kits, so on. And we aim to ship everything out by the end of May at the latest. Deployment occurs between late May and early July. We allow a little bit of flexibility in the northern sites to deploy a little bit later if necessary. Because given the thaw is a little bit delayed, as long as the cells up there are deployed before the pups in that area become volant, sampling should be fine, or consistent between years. And equipment and data are returned after sampling is complete in July. We ask the leaders to kind of send it along within 2 weeks if possible. And we also ask that the grid leaders keep a copy of all data on their hard drives so we can verify that we've received information once it comes to our door. See 8 months there between July and February are reserved for data analysis. This is including things like auto ID processing through Kaleidoscope Pro and NABat, including all the work with metadata and everything else like that, and then the manual analysis as well. And last, we start reporting for our grants and preparing for final data sets for the USGS and other databases in February to March. This date deadline is more or less due to our funding sources here, so you might find that varies for you. So acoustic identification is just a quick example of an acoustic recording. And you can find a lot of the information here under the Continental NABat guidance document. So with that, the analysis first starts with an auto ID program. We use Kaleidoscope Pro and NABat in BC, both IDs in concert. Because any auto ID programs are prone to misclassification, and we're using our results in very fine scales. We also run everything through manual analysis at the end. And you can refer to the acoustic analysis section of this NABat guidance on the nabatmonitoring.org website for further information. But in BC, as I said, we pass our files first through auto ID to categorize recordings by suspected species. And we're using Kaleidoscope Pro and NABat programs. And we're using both because it provides a little bit more information and because each program approaches the problem of assigning an ID slightly differently. And auto ID in general helps speed up the process because it makes decisions and mistakes in a consistent manner, and then it gives those categories for the manual analyst to go through and say, this is likely to be a little brown bat or whatever else. In this way, the analyst can focus their efforts and spend a little bit more time on the species that are also prone to misclassification, differentiating little brown bat from red bat, for instance. And for the manual ID step, we ask the analysts to not change the ID from auto ID unless there is evidence to suggest it's incorrect. Unless it's clear it's noise or something along those lines, or unless it's clear that the auto ID said it was a silver hair when it's actually a big brown or whatever else. In those cases, the reviewer may downgrade to a species couplet, which indicates the file may be either one of two species, or change the outright ID if it's absolutely clear that the auto ID is completely incorrect. We often suggest analysts change the ID when recording quality is low. They can even go so far as putting a frequency category grouping, although this does reduce the ability of us to use that recording in our data analysis at the end. We often just kind of have to toss out the low quality recordings because they're not definitive enough to actually include. Otherwise, when Auto ID chooses inappropriate pulses for classification, they can change the IDs or discard. And then low percentages of pulses in a recording, if a low percentage of pulses in a recording passed Auto ID at all, is another reason. So one of our other deviations from continental procedure here is that we analyze all high-quality passive detector recordings and all transect recordings. The continental minimum suggests only confirming species present per detector per night is necessary. This would mean identifying potential files for each species until the first occurrence appears that night, then moving on to the next night, and then eventually the next species and doing the same thing. It does speed up analysis a little bit, but the additional sample size does provide us a little bit more confidence that the numbers we're seeing are relevant. So for each deployment, you also must consider that final ID is reliant on proper detector placement. Bats echolocate differently based on what is in their environment, and in the cluttered areas, many species tend to make very similar calls, particularly myota species. Detectors should be placed in an open area at least 7 to 10 kilometers from the nearest source of clutter, and note that this is a really low minimum value. Further from the clutter would be better, so like 20 meters or so or more. The recorded bats may still be flying close to clutter anyway, though, so your diagnostic pulses may not be seen even with proper detector placement. As an example, if there are only a few fringed bats in your area, you only get a couple of recordings from them, or sorry, they only fly by a couple times, and each time they just happen to be flying very close to the tree line, it would be quite unlikely that you get identifiable recordings from those bats. It's just kind of random chance. Now for our funding is broken down into 6 main categories, or at least how we spend. The largest share, as Orville said, 30% is spent on contracted analysis or acoustic analysis. If available, you might actually try using a full-time or staff analyst to save some cost. For the scale of our program, we didn't actually find too much interest in a full-time year-long analyst position so far. So we've just been using the contracted analysis. Next, 22% of our funding right now goes to program coordination for data management, grid cell coordination, creating procedures to streamline future user monitoring, things along those lines. We expect we can reduce this a little bit more in future years once we've kind of sorted everything out. 15% of our current budget is earmarked for deployment costs. This includes roughly 2 days of time for both deploying and retrieving passives, and then driving transects in each grid cell. Note that this is quite a bit smaller. This is quite a bit smaller portion of our budget than it otherwise would be, because a very large amount of our deployment is actually donated as in kind. The BC Parks and MOE grid cells are done by staff for BC Parks and MOE, so we don't pay those costs. If this is all paid for by your program, you'd likely see this deployment cost taking a larger portion of your budget. And then the remaining portions are smaller items. Equipment management costs, equipment repair and replacement, reporting, office space, things like that. For our locations, we haven't seen very much detector theft or anything like that. We've had, I'd say, 2 or 3 stolen since the start of our program, but it's been a fairly small portion of our budget replacing those detectors, I mean. So maximizing efficiency. In order to make the best use of these funds, we have taken some steps to maximize the efficiency each year. We aim to minimize the number of analysts we use, as this increases the consistency of ID between cells. It increases the analysis speed, and it reduces the QA time. We've also established simplified data management procedures to help minimize the amount of effort we need to put in for each grid cell. We send the field forms to the grid leaders for them to quickly and easily record said information in nightly conditions, send it back to us, and then we automatically populate it into a data set. We also promote the clear dates for each step of the grid cell deployment process, like I went over. This helps improve the speed of collecting our full set of data and returning the equipment at the end of the summer. And then last, we've started to adopt procedures to accommodate large data sets, including batch metadata processing, automatic assembly of these grid cell forms, and things like that, which greatly speed up the creation of our final data set that contains over 200,000 bat recordings each year. Even simply managing the size of these things can be a little bit of difficulty because they do end up being about over 2 terabytes per year, including noise files and stuff. So some of the metadata can be input into each file through Kaleidoscope Pro metadata forms. This is just a quick screenshot of what the Kaleidoscope Pro processing window using the NABat Continental Program metadata form would be. As you run the initial processing of your files, you can input site-specific conditions into that section in the lower left, and it tags each file in the batch with metadata like start times, end times, grid cell number, so on. And after analysis, you can run the metadata extraction to create quickly assemble a working data set. This is very user-friendly, and you can refer to the NABat monitoring website for detailed instructions and videos and things like that. On our end, I've also been using Python scripts to import and extract metadata in a very similar manner. Okay, next we'll talk about challenges and lessons learned. First thing, grid cell selection is more or less a balance between logistics and ideal scientific standards. Grid leaders are encouraged to choose high priority cells to monitor, but they may also discount cells in their area if they have no reasonable monitoring sites, or very poor habitat, and so on. Understandably, grid leaders can then be inclined to select overly convenient sites if they're even if they're low priority, and we should still work to avoid this wherever possible. Because these low priority sites are often high grid cell ID, this means they'd be weighted far less in the ultimate analyses. Note that the coordinators should work closely with grid leaders during grid cell and site selection steps to ensure the appropriate grid cells are selected, and as well that the detectors are placed properly in varying habitat types, placed away from clutter, and 1 or 2 are placed in movement corridors where possible. This can be tricky to do over the phone and web meetings, so in-person meetings are always advisable here. If you can travel to the sites yourself, that's even better. Having the expert on hand always increases the likelihood that your participants will actually ask questions and learn a little bit more. So another challenge for us, at least, was equipment shipping. This proved to be very costly and time-consuming. We used to send our kits around using Greyhound shipping for about half the cost of what it now is. In 2018, they closed the doors, I believe, and the shipping between grid cells went from $120 per step to over $250. One option we're using to address this is actually transferring equipment with the movement of staff. For instance, when a staff member needs to attend a meeting in one city, we can use their movement between the cities to transfer equipment if a new grid cell, if they're closer to the next grid cell in the list, for instance. Otherwise, we just unfortunately had to boost our budget up a little bit more to accommodate the increased cost. So, next challenge. When we started in 2016, we ran acoustic analysis with what appeared to be the most cost-efficient method at the time, and that was relying on grid cell leaders. Evolving that analysis to grid leaders has, however, been a little bit less efficient than we expected, because with so many different grid cell leaders, there were natural inconsistencies in ID, and it was very time-consuming to correct this. For instance, what one person was willing to call a silver hair bat was actually closer to what another grid leader would have said it was a big brown / silver hair couplet, and things like that. So Another thing was also that grid leaders often didn't spend much time conducting acoustic analyses outside of NABat because they weren't, it wasn't their major part of their career. So they often needed to spend several hours refamiliarizing themselves with with Acoustic ID in general. And that's while hiring contractors is more expensive per hour, it does often speed up the process enough that we do actually save analysis costs by doing that. Of course, an ideal solution would likely be in-house staff analysis if you have that option. Okay. Now another challenge is just motivating the data return. As grid leaders are often volunteers or biologists whose jobs do not actually include NABat, it's understandable that data submission can take a little bit longer than we'd like. We've started to work to address this by including pre-addressed and prepaid envelopes with most of our NABat kits. This reduces the amount of effort the grid leaders need to do to submit their data. They just basically copy the data off, assemble it into folder structure, and then send it our way. We've also assembled quick and easy field forms that are intended to speed up the site information recording process. They can just take these things to the field with them and fill them out there. And that's that was another step that was kind of slowing down the grid leader submission. So securing local funds can be extremely helpful to set up and run individual grid cells. Grid leaders are often a key ally in sorting out these funds. However, these funds are not necessarily long-term solutions because they're often designed for direct conservation action, and sustainable monitoring isn't necessarily overly attractive on a local scale. In our case, local funds were invaluable in actually establishing grid cells in 2016. Most of these cells are now supported by our main program grants. We were able to do that through a little bit more efficiency in spending, as I was talking about earlier. Okay, so we'll move on to the conclusion questions. Just a quick point out, we have the training videos that Orville mentioned. We focused more or less on the equipment types we have, so SM2 and SM4 passive detector deployment videos. These are useful to help refresh people's minds and help bring the new participants up to speed. And then we have some more videos for Transect recordings as well. These cover the the SD1 and 2 NABats and EM Touch as well. As I mentioned earlier, you can also find procedures and videos for metadata manipulation, data submission to USGS, and various other information, especially in the Continental guidance document that's found on nabatmonitoring.org. This site has a ton of other resources for you to read and watch, so I'd highly recommend giving that a look if you haven't already. Overall, to sum up, the NABat acoustic monitoring does have a few key limitations and strengths we must acknowledge. It is a very short monitoring period per grid cell, which does make small-scale inference a little bit more difficult. There is still potential for errors in acoustic ID also, regardless of how much QA and redundancy we do. Plus, with Transects only, we're estimating species relative abundance each year on a decently small sample size, so this can be a little bit imprecise on a single year basis, and for local smaller scale too. Note we are looking at using passives to supplement this to address that issue a little bit, but the efficacy of that is still unclear yet. We're basically just looking into it. Now on the strength side, the procedure does provide a relatively low-cost, large-scale monitoring baseline. It is very low effort for the field staff in each grid cell. It's only 2 days of deployment. It yields, it's only 2 days of actual work time. And it yields roughly a reasonably accurate sense of species assemblage and relative abundance. And the big key thing here is it includes trends over time. Changes in species relative abundance, like what you would see from white nose syndrome, also should be very easy to spot, expecting large dramatic declines. So, that's the end of the general presentation information. I'd just kind of like to thank you all for your time and bring up the funders and partners as well again. It's essential to establishing this monitoring program, and their involvement can't be overstated, basically. So at this point, is there anybody who'd like to ask any questions?
Thank you very much, Jason and Orville. Before we'll go into questions, I just want to thank you both, but also thank you, Cori, for your work behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. And I think your presentation really did a great job at demonstrating what's required to accomplish a province-wide NABat program, and there were lots of lessons learned. I think one of the takeaways for me, one of the many takeaways is really how important it is to have people, staff in your positions to be part of this effort. So with you, Jason, and Cori with the WCSC as overall coordinator in the province, but also having Orville as the bat conservation specialist and a coordinator in a provincial position, working with partners such as what he mentioned, such as Park Service and CWS to coordinate logistics for deployment and funding and data analysis and so much more. So that structure, I think, is something important to keep in mind for other jurisdictions that are considering a province or territory-wide scale in these NABat efforts. So thank you again. And yes, we do have some time for questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or if you prefer or can't unmute yourself, you can use the chat box. And I'll do my best to keep up and read out the questions and have the presenters answer these.
Hi, it's Diana Geekus with CWS. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
I have a few questions. One is I'm curious what people think about doing alternate year monitoring. So whether you split up the number of grid cells between alternate years, or you just do the whole program alternate years. So my thinking is reduce costs and effort and that kind of thing, and how that might affect the results. That's my first question. My second question is, has people given thought to the MODIS network, and what are their thoughts about using that? And my third question would be cost for the acoustic analysis, if there's any dollar amount, like per grid cell.
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with your third question because that's the easiest one for me to get out of the way. The cost for acoustic analysis that we earmark is about $1,200 per grid cell. This is obviously including the 7 days of recordings that we have. So if you go to the 4-day minimum, you will find that's a little bit less. As well, if you do analysis by species presence per detector per night, you should find that's a little bit less as well.
Okay.
This also does vary based on the species in your area. If you have few species like eastern in Ontario and places like that, you might also find that it could be a little bit faster. But that's just kind of my own guess here. I don't actually have experience with that, but smaller set of potential species would likely make it easier.
Okay.
Sorry, can you restate question 2 again?
Sure. The other two questions were alternate year. What do you think about either splitting the total number of grid cells? So you would do a program every year, but split them in half, or doing a whole program every other year?
Mm-hmm. I have to admit I'm not really familiar on this one. If Cori has any thoughts on this one, she can feel free to jump in. I personally would probably be inclined to do it every year, but I mean, I'm not familiar with the statistical implications of that. If you do alternate between years that do half the sample size each year or whatever else. And sorry, Cori, you're on the call, right?
Hey, this is Brian Reichert. Can you hear me?
Hi, Brian.
I just wanted to chime in if that's okay.
Yeah, totally. And Brian is the continental coordinator here for the NABat program.
Yeah, so in response to that question, I would say if you're going to skip years, it's really sort of what your objectives are. the objectives for the program are to have people to build trend information from the data collection efforts. And so if you skip years, usually want to think about sort of 3 data points in time creating reliable trend information. Sometimes you need 4 points in time. And so if you're skipping years, basically it'll take you 6 to 7 years to understand trends. And then I think the other issue that you have to weigh with sort of not having consistencies in sites between years. So if you did half the sampling effort in year 1 and changed over in year 2 is just the lack of certainty with the estimates for any single year. So you can get some predictions about where species are occurring, let's say, but your confidence intervals would be quite large, such that you wouldn't be really certain. You'd be, half as certain about those estimates, and so neither one is ideal, I would say. So those are just some things to weigh. So we try to get folks, the guidance is to and then survey those same grid cells every year.
Thank you, Brian. And sorry, there was a second question you were asking.
The third question was modus. I don't know. So modus is when the animals have pit tags in them, and so there's some thinking that you can use it for obviously birds and bats, and it's very expensive to install the towers, but once they're installed, then they're available.
This is Cori. Can you guys hear me?
Hi, Cori.
Hi. We've been talking a lot about getting modus up in the west. Unfortunately, it's not actually a pit tag that goes on the bats. It's a radio transmitter that would have to be glued onto the bats. And that does have a short lifespan. And it is, as you said, it's quite costly. So the bats would have to be captured and the transmitters put on their backs. And then some of those transmitters don't last all that long. You can get a couple of weeks, and that's assuming that the glue holds well. Rock crevice roosting bats, a little bit harder on their transmitters as they go in and out of the roost. So, so I think, yes, the modus actually is of interest, especially understanding migration routes. And here in the West, we are starting to talk about it more and more to try and get something like that going. But it would be to complement NABat and would definitely be answering, I think, different questions.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Cori. So any other questions?
No, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Great. So we'll open it up to anybody else. Anything from the rest of the audience?
This is Jordi. I did see, actually, Brian, thank you for chiming in there. I was hoping that you would. I also saw that you sent a quick note to me that NABat did just post new guidance documents on how to use more than one auto ID software for data processing. So I assume that that's on the NABat, the general NABat website and available to everyone.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's great. Yeah, and then everyone who's interested in this should definitely check out, of course, the main NABat website, because that's also loaded with great resources.
Definitely.
Any other questions from anyone? I'm hearing none, and I'm seeing no others in the chat. So I hope it means that everyone's very satisfied with the information. I sure am. And as mentioned before, this webinar is recorded, so we'll make it available online so that everyone can see it for the future to come. And again, thank you to Jason, to Orville, and to Cori for making this webinar happen. I know a lot of people are going to find this very, very valuable.
Thank you. You already as I think Orville mentioned as well, but we're also willing to take any questions. If anybody wants to send us emails afterwards, we're happy to help out in any way.
If anyone is looking for their email addresses, if you don't have them, just feel free to message me and I'll get you in touch. Thank you very much, everyone, and happy holidays.